Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's final and 16th webinar for the UNESCO Global Network of Learning Cities webinar series. Today's topic is on human and civil rights in the context of COVID-19. The webinar will last approximately an hour and 15 minutes today. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the UIL YouTube channel. A link to that particular page is going to be shared with you in the chat. The format for today's webinar is similar to that of the previous weeks. We'll be hearing from individual speakers and listening to their presentations, and we'll follow with a question and answer session. I'll try to ask a question to each participant after they've finished their presentation to provide an opportunity to clarify any particular point that we might be interested in hearing more of. If you're interested in hearing from us after this webinar, and if you'd like to receive the mailbox, the content in your mailbox, please sign up to the UIL newsletter by clicking in the link provided in the chat. The audience for today is muted. I kindly ask that you use the Q&A to ask questions you may have for the participants for today. We'll be using those particular questions during the session at the end of all the presentations. And lastly, we will try to not go over time today, but we intend on finishing within the hour and 15-minute mark. Please note that the period for membership applications for the UNESCO Global Network of Learning Cities, the GNLC, has been extended, and cities can now apply until June 30th, 2020. National commissions have until the 31st of July, 2020 to endorse the procedure. The information for this particular membership application form and other documents is now available in the chat as well. So for today's webinar, we have joining us Mr. David Achua-Rena, the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning Director, who will be giving today's welcoming remarks, followed by a presentation by Mr. Eduardo Lopez Moreno from UN Habitat, the head of Knowledge and Innovation. We'll be hearing from Ms. Dionysia Ampatsidi, the advisor to the mayor of Ioannina in Greece on social and migration policy. Joining us today as well is Mr. Francisco Rodriguez, a lawyer, economic, social, and cultural rights division for the Civil Association for Equality and Justice in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We'll also be hearing from the city of Melitopol in Ukraine, Mr. Sergi Prima, the vice mayor. And last but not least, we'll be hearing from Laura Alejandra Martinez, the advisor at the Institute of Education on Human Rights and Democracy for the Organization of Ibero-American States, OEI, in Bogota, Colombia. We have a few panelists that have not yet joined us today, so if some of us haven't joined by the time it's their turn to speak, we'll be switching the order of the agenda a little bit. So right now I've given you the list of people as they appear in the agenda. But just note that that might change a little bit for today. And now, to give us opening and welcoming remarks and to give us a bit of context as to why we're choosing to speak about the topic of human rights and civil rights in the context of COVID-19, I'd like to open the floor to Mr. David Achua-Rena.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning to all. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this last issue of the UL series on the impact of the COVID-19 on education and the responses at local level through the experience of the members of the UNESCO Global Network of Learning Cities. I mean, this has been a very rich and a very vibrant series with a number of topics that have been explored. We had, I think, very vibrant debates on topics which are of high relevance, of interest for cities, but also for the broader community. Today, for this final seminar, we choose to select a topic which I think it's at the really at the core of the public debate in many countries today. We've seen increasingly a discussion and sometimes a tension between what we would call the considerations for health and for protecting the life of the people, and in a context where through the measures that were taken, a number of the fundamental rights were actually jeopardized and sometimes suspended. So we can see that this is becoming now a very important concern. It's a concern and a matter of debate for, of course, governments, for local governments as well, and for the civil society. We are now about almost exactly 3 months since the World Health Organization declared that the COVID-19 outbreak had reached the level of a global pandemic. As a consequence, the WHO actually called for governments to take urgent and very drastic measures to stop the spread of the virus. As a result, most governments actually took a very important and radical measures through the establishment of a so-called state of emergency, which includes also and implied that a number of human rights, can be derogated at least for a limited period of time, and we've seen that in most, parts of the world. It's important to recall that human rights laws recognize that restrictions of some human rights can be justified when they have a legal basis and respond to very specific circumstances. We've seen that for responding to the COVID-19 crisis, governments have enforced limitations on freedom of movement and imposed isolations and quarantine measures. And this, of course, has constituted a major, a major limitation of fundamental rights. We've seen also that in a number of countries, in order to monitor the spread of the virus, governments have also taken measures to track, people, and this has also, contributed to raising additional concerns regarding the impact of the situation on the fundamental rights, and in particular through the implementation of a state of control that sometimes is seen as becoming even a threat to democracy. With this exceptional situation has called for exceptional measures, it's important to note the fact that this crisis has had very different impacts for different groups in society. The confinement measures and lockdown have not been able to be put in place fully, for all categories of population. We know that in slums, in very in informal communities, in refugee camps, it has been very difficult to impose those measures, and therefore, again, the impact of the crisis and of the virus has had very different, effects on different populations. It's important also to note that this crisis has actually affected the rights of certain groups of the population. We've seen, the rise of sometimes discrimination, stigmatization of certain groups in society. We've seen in almost all countries an important rise of domestic violence, and in particular against children and against women. The crisis has also revealed how certain groups have been particularly, affected. This is also, a way in which additional discrimination, in a way, has been imposed, and the freedom of expression has also been affected in sometimes to a very large extent in this current, situation. Those are very important issues for society, for democracy. As you know, UNESCO is very attentive to the protection and promotion of basic human rights. Uh, the different networks, including the networks of learning cities, are very important instruments for promoting human rights, starting also with the right to education. Now, within the context of the local government and the crisis has also called upon cities to enforce the measures that have been taken, including enforcing the lockdown, but also protecting the right to education and protecting, in that context, the most vulnerable members of the population. And this is what we're going to discuss today through this webinar. I'm pleased to introduce again our colleagues from UN Habitat, from the cities of Melitopol, and also the city of Ionina, who are going to share with us their experience, together also with reflections from our colleagues from the Organization of the Ibero-American States, as well as the Civil Association for Equality and Justice in Argentina. So I'm sure this will be a very vibrant and rich exchange and discussions, which I think will complement very well, some of the thinking and some of the findings that we already shared through this series of webinars. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much, David, for these opening remarks and for setting the floor for everybody. I'd like to invite our first speaker for today to give us a perspective on the topic of human rights in the context of COVID-19 from UN Habitat. Mr. Lopez Moreno, the floor is yours for your presentation. If you have any slides, feel free to share them on the screen. And if not, please just go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I think the introduction was excellent because it set the stage of what we are going to discuss. Let me start by asking a question. How the world will be after COVID-19? I believe it will be with COVID. This brings to us some fundamental keywords and key reflection. We are talking about unpredictability of the future, a world of uncertainty, and in clarity or lack of clarity of what is the meaning of return and what is the meaning of use and abuse of human rights, as I'm going to explain. We will need to, and we are doing, I think, to understand, to assess, and to adapt very fast. We are adapting, for instance, today, teleworking, online consumption, use of art and culture. We might be facing some form of a digital dictatorship or digital exclusion and inclusion. And we will be changing some fundamental things like production and business in the sense of authorship and inclusion. The pandemic, and this is just as an introduction, will dramatically change or is already changing the way we interact, the way we work, the way we live, the way we rest. But it's also changing the instruments to overcome this crisis. And in many places, it's putting on hold human rights. In others, it's adapting fast rights. And in others, it's imposing another narrative of what human rights could be. The status quo that I define what is good, is very rapidly changing and is being transformed. However, in many places, I would say in most places, we don't know the speed and we don't know the deepness of these changes. A new reality is emerging, but the question is, with the same inequalities, with the same forms of exclusion, with the same forms of marginalization, and we will discuss some of these things. This reality is imposing first-hand decisions on others and on us, and the cities, in the countries, and in the world. I wrote a book about the slums and slum dwellers, and I used to say that they were living in a world in which the future was under construction. And I think now all of us in the same sense will become some form of slum dwellers, but without the slums, because we were living in a world that will be always under construction. There will be, and there is already, we can see these different forms of responses. Some people are opting for isolation, for distance, for separation, and even xenophobia, discrimination very clearly. A divided world, as the Secretary General of the UN mentioned. These people will be building walls, physical and social. Others are opting for solidarity, for compassion, for kindness, for empathy, and they are building ties and bridges. But the governments where they live are opting exactly for the same kind of responses, isolation or integration, in which in both the notion of rights will take completely different dimension and perspective. Culture, as the way we understand, will be a different kind of driver of what is happening. For instance, it needs to help us to understand what is the notion of believing or not believing. In most places, as we can see, people don't believe in the data that governments are producing. They don't believe in their responses. Even they don't believe in the disease. And this is bringing some forms of media and political powers connection that are very rapidly changing. We need to rethink the notion of togetherness, understanding that we are not islands, but we are links that are changing. And in this sense, something that because of the economic situation that COVID is bringing, will bring a fundamental change in the political culture, in claiming our rights to work, rights to housing, right to many things, and social instability and political crisis will certainly emerge in many places. COVID-19 has taught us very important lessons, and I would like, with regards to the theme that I'm discussing, to mention some of them. The pandemic is an urban pandemic so far. 95%, and we counted in countries and cities, 95% of cases are in urban areas, or in particular regions in the world. So it's a crisis of cities. And this will require a sort of recalibration of the role of cities and the role of rights associated to cities. The director of WHO is saying that it's very possible that in a second or a third wave or movement of the pandemic, it eventually will move to rural areas. Remembering that in some of our countries, rural areas are 10, 15, 20%, but in other parts of the world, they are 70%. And the question is how we are going to territorialize the pandemic and what will be the role of cities in responding to this. It's important to understand that connected to the Millennium Development Goals, cities help rural areas to reduce poverty in more than 550 million people. It's very possible that cities may play a similar role in the pandemic when it comes to rural areas, in case it comes. We have done a study and producing a report that is called The State of the Cities with COVID or Post-COVID, we hope. And this data that I'm mentioning is very preliminary, almost anecdotic, and in that sense, a little bit, I would say, irresponsible for me to present it because it's not based in completely data, but in data and intuition. But I think it's still important. When we compare developed countries and cities, the pandemic shows a very clear division of strata poor versus non-poor. And the relationship is people contagious and people dead, 1 to 3. This is data, for instance, from the US, from New York, and other European countries. But when we take developing nations, the relationship of the strata, poor or non-poor, being affected by COVID moves to 1 to 5 in slum areas. In Brazil, for instance, where there is data on COVID, 6 people die in bidonvilles or slum areas, whereas 1 dies in the consolidated part of the city. When you take countries where you have high number of population coming to work that are residents, and a lot of this is in the Arab world, we see a relationship that goes, in the cases where there is data, Singapore, Kuwait, and others, up to 1 to 8 in the terms of strata poor, non-poor. What this is telling us is that this disease is correlating strongly to inequalities structures and to the provision or lack of provision of rights in the case of health rights and others. So we need to rethink the city. And in this sense, the relationship between functions and what relations are in cities, rural, urban, and the localization of productions and the notion of proximity. We need to rethink things like housing, transport, but the relationship to other aspects that are much broader, climate change and COVID, for instance. We have been talking, and I would say abusing, of some powers or some elements or notions like build back better, build back better. But the reality is that the dynamics of power, the difference between different groups, hidden powers, are telling us that in cities, priorities, resources, possibilities are not emerging from consensus, but are emerging from dominant groups. And when this happens, then Build Back Better, in fact, represent a set of priorities that are again reproducing some of these structural inequalities. And this is what we should pay attention. There are some, one minute
left.
Okay, there are some false dichotomies or assumptions. For instance, whether we should have or not at this stage rights in cities, or we will defer this right to the future. Whether greener cities are better in terms of densities, and densities have been the culprit of this pandemic in terms of thinking that the future will be in suburbia, with low density, with segregation, and this will rethink the notion of compactness and togetherness. The second is that we need to rethink the equation of how we do things. I would like to conclude in 1 minute to say, if up to now 95% of cases in terms of contagious and in terms of disease have been in cities, it means that the response so far, obviously it might change in the future, it should be a city response. And that brings a fundamental question on governance mechanisms, governance structures, and the paradigm of governance bringing much and better rights to local authorities. We are still in the making of these decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moreno. Maybe just because you mentioned how hit the vulnerable groups were for those living in slums and informal settlements during the pandemic, could you maybe share with us a few concrete examples on how UN Habitat has been responding to that particular aspect of the crisis in the context of human rights, but also if in fact there has been specific responses developed for cities?
Yes, and perhaps I would like to use really the theme of this discussion, because it has different entry points. And then you have in some places, for instance, slums in Brazil, where non-state actors, and sometimes non-state actors that are criminal actors, gangs, are taking very important response. The question is whether you work with them or not. And in general, in our case, what we have been doing is considering that local actors living in the slums should be empowered. And this empowerment means recognizing some possibilities for them to provide services, to organize community, and to bring some local water, sanitation, and conditions that are not there. So we have been working with them at the level of advocacy, at the level of empowerment, at the level of organizing society, but also providing some specific immediate responses to them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And if perhaps later on we can talk about specific resources that could then be shared with the broader audiences as well in terms of examples, that would be great. But for now, we'll be moving on to our second speaker. Miss Dionysia from Greece, the city of Ioannina. You are with us now, and I will upload your slides in just a second. And if you don't mind just putting your video on, that would be very great.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Great. Well, please go ahead.
Yes. So, greetings from Ioannina. On behalf of Mr. Moises Elisaf, the mayor of Ioannina, I would like to warmly thank you for your invitation to present the response of the municipality of Ioannina to COVID-19. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So, our city, Ioannina, is in Greece and is the capital of Epirus region with approximately 133 residents. Something worth mentioning is, and being a challenge, is the fact that the Epirus is an aging region. Greece is classified second after Italy in the percentage of elderly population in the whole European Union. So our city has both a general and a university hospital, which was designated as a referral hospital for potential coronavirus cases, covering the region of Epirus and the region of Ionian Island. Could you go to the next, please? Thank you. So on the first picture, you can see the city location on the world map, and on the second, the location on Greece map. As you can see, Ioannina is in northwestern Greece, near to the border with Albania, almost 60 kilometers, and 80 kilometers from the port of Igoumenitsa, which is one of the largest passenger ports of Greece, connecting northwestern mainland Greece with the Ionian Island and Italy. So have an exit point from Italy and an entry point from Albania. It was also a challenge for us. Could you go? Yes, the response. So the municipality of Ioannina has been on the front line of response to COVID-19 health emergency, and has taken necessary precautionary measures to contain the spread of this virus by establishing a management mechanism with all the relevant actors, services, stakeholders, and volunteers in order to ensure that all members of municipal society have the information they need to stay healthy, follow governing guidelines, and protect those as at higher risk. So we create a helpline so as to record the needs of marginalized and vulnerable groups and provide psychosocial support. We enhance also the mobile units of the Help at Home program with staff and funds in order to provide support door to door to vulnerable groups such as elderly, people with disabilities, people with chronic illness, and people in poverty by covering their basic necessities, supplies, medication, medical actions, so as maximizing their safety. At the same time, we training the social service staff on protective measures. And moreover, we created a feedback mechanisms through telephone questionnaire about the response on their need. Could you go to the next one, please? Okay, thank you. Due to the fact that in the lockdown period, the home had become the frontline defense against the coronavirus, and in order to protect those in higher risk, such as homeless, the Organization of Social Protection, Solidarity and Preschool Education, which runs the dormitory of homeless, altered the relevant charter in order to provide shelter and psychosocial support to homeless people who do not fulfill the criteria at homeless dormitory, such as addicted to alcohol, drugs, and people with active mental illness. Also, the local prison of Ioannina, we have a prison here with almost 300 inmates. The social services of our municipality provided personal protective equipment and food assistance to the inmates, and also support the distribution door to door to almost 1,000 beneficial families in extreme poverty. of food and basic materials of the Greek Fund of European Aid to the most deprived program. So let's go to the next slide regarding Roma. So approximately 300 Roma families live in the area of Ioannina, some of them in poor conditions. One of the challenges was the fact that they were mostly not recorded. In cooperation with the representative of each settlement, we managed to accomplish the outreach and cover their needs, such as food, hygiene items, personal protective equipment, and disinfections. Additionally, we raised awareness about prevention and response to COVID-19. Could you go to the next, please, slide? So here is regarding our actions to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Municipality of Ioannina, from the very beginning of the humanitarian crisis in Greece, has hosted in camp and in urban settings a significant number of refugees, asylum seekers, and accompanied children. Currently, it hosts more than 2,500 refugees and asylum seekers, mainly from the Syrian Arab Republic, Republic of Iraq, and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. On the population breakdown, you can see in pink those who reside in Ioannina. It is with the pink color. You can see also in this line the nationalities, the legal status, and the age and gender. Could you go to the next, please? Thank you. So we raised awareness about prevention and response to COVID-19 to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in urban settings and in camp, in cooperation with police, NGOs, and representatives of migrants, provided information on prevention of COVID-19, and moreover, police vehicles daily disseminating the information and recorded messages in native language on camp and neighborhoods. The local radio provides information on migrants in native languages, and we distributed information materials to employers of migrants. Could you go to the next? Oh, thank you. So this is, in this slide, you can see the map of confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Greece. We have approximately 3,000 confirmed cases, and 1,300 almost have recovered, and 181 deaths. So in this, in the cross on the map indicates the location of prefecture of Ioannina. And until now in Ioannina we have 3 confirmed cases. These are residents of Ioannina, and no deaths. And the last one is, thank you for your attention. The last slide, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dionysia.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation and for explaining what has been happening in the city of Ioannina. It's interesting to see that you've had very few cases, and the approach is taken with vulnerable groups such as migrants, refugees, and also Roma population. But maybe on the context of human rights and civil rights, would you be able to speak to potentially whether or not the city has witnessed discrimination and stigmatization towards these vulnerable groups that you mentioned, and if so, if there have been specific mechanisms put in place to deal with those particular challenges?
We have some cases through the media, and in cooperation with them, we have a meeting, and we discuss about the discriminate and of refugees. So until now, we don't have a mechanism, to be honest. But
no,
we record all the incidents. We have a mechanism to record the incidents, but nothing, to deal with that.
Okay. Okay. I have lots of questions to ask you, and maybe we can get back to them and also to the rest of the group. But let's go through the different presentations first, and then we'll come back to to a few of the questions that would relate to your presentation. Thank you so much for your presentation. So we'll move on now, and we'll switch the order a little bit around. We'll go with Laura Martinez from the OEI. Laura, are you with us? And if so, I will start your slides now. And so you can go ahead as soon as you are ready.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the floor is yours.
Well, hello. Here in Colombia is 6 a.m. So good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Alejandra Martinez. I am a member of the Institute of Education on Human Rights and Democracy of the Organization of Ibero-American States. On behalf of the organization, we thank you for the invitation for talk about this important discussion. First of all, please, next slide. Thank you. First of all, it's important to point out that our role as an organization is to support the efforts of the national governments in strengthening education, science, and culture. Therefore, our natural allies are the ministries of education, with which we work hand by hand to promote projects that build peace in the territories by preparing the human being for the responsible exercise of freedom, solidarity, and the defense of human rights. This pandemic has highlighted the serious structural difficulties of the states and the challenge that we as institutions serving the people face. In this sense, we have been working in three main lines, which seek to confront this adverse situation. Next slide, please. First of all, we're facing a situation of total breakdown in which children stop going to school, but it doesn't mean that they stop studying. However, neither the governments or educational institutions or teachers were not prepared to teach from the distance or through a screen. That's why we have been working together with ministries of education and particularly with Colombia's ministry, advancing the construction of methodologies, tools, and different contents designed specifically for virtuality that allow to attend approximately the population of students that are 60% that count with internet or has access to a computer, a cell phone, or some medium that allow them to access this modality. Also, we have improved our virtual platforms and those of our allies in order to offer virtual courses that work as an alternative to this shift to virtual modality. These actions not are only focused on the students, also in the teachers, because they are the facilitators and the main people in this training process. However, this is not the only difficulty brought up the pandemic. Today, the quarantine has made more time for family members to spend together, a mandatory meeting that begins to show the difficulties in living together. Their action is aimed at preventing domestic violence and gender-based violence within households, in strengthening family ties. In the case of Colombia, we work with the Family Welfare Institute. We have been able to extend the lines of care and the importance of the complaint. This is one of the situations in which we could question the civil right to privacy and confront us with a discussion about how much institutionalists can get involved in the private sphere. In addition, the third line of action is a regional training program on democracy and citizenship for the guarantee of human rights, consisting in 8 actions on these issues. This program involves the participation of 13 regional offices of our organization in all the region, and the support of more than 30 public and private partners, including ministries, government entities, civil society organizations, and private companies, included the Spain Cooperation Agency. We are partners that work around the empowerment of the children and the youth. These actions involve the regional construction of a curriculum guide that will rethink the education model, not only in the face of this situation, but also in the face of the existing structural difficulties with citizenship and human rights as a focus. Also, the implementation of an educational week that articulates human rights and virtuality in different educational institutions throughout the region from a youth perspective, and the implementation of an educational campaign in good governance and the fight against corruption. These actions involve different sectors of society around a common dialogue that is so important, from students and teachers to public workers and members of the military. There, the next slide, please. There we begin to see the main challenge of talking about human and civil rights in the middle of the pandemic. So the first question is a question very important. How we talk about citizenship when we are in social isolation? If citizenship is understood to mean the exercise of a series of rights by membership of belonging to a community, how is citizenship exercised without social interaction? Can it be exercised in a virtual way? Or maybe do I feel citizen from home? Or does citizenship only be exercised to the public sphere? This question encourage the building of a citizenship that, beyond the interaction of people, emphasize solidarity, respect for the other, recognition of the difference, and common well-being. It's a challenge that we as an organization are taking up from academia and building an Ibero-American model of education. The next challenge is to ponder the discourse. How can we as an international institution that supports the work of the governments speak of an education that emphasizes respect for human rights and empowerment when government decisions restrict the very right to freedom of movement, or probably the privacy? So this is the evidence of the debate of the theory of the state, where individual freedoms are yielded to the need to guarantee the common good, but it's extraordinary and should not be excessive. And the third challenge of our organization is to be resilient, change the model, and adjust to the circumstances. Surely the education is not going to be the same. The modality will be more articulated, face-to-face with the virtual one. Greater use will be made of information and communications technologies, and the family will be an essential nucleus in the formation process. While we believe that it is very important to guarantee, to protect and promote human rights in full, but scenarios such as this make it possible to weigh up common good against the individual good. Probably a Rousseau debate, and it will be democratic values and citizen competence and all the education in this regard that will make a decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your presentation. That was right on time too, so well done. Thank you. A few questions, and also a question came up on the Q&A, which reminds me that I'd like to invite everybody again that may have questions for the participants and the speakers today to ask them directly using the Q&A option. But one question for you, in what you mentioned, the role of citizenship and kind of what how that plays in the current context when it comes to guaranteeing human rights. Maybe if you could give us examples or strategies or measures or innovative responses on how can citizens be encouraged to play an active role in countering the virus and its spread, but in a voluntary way, despite the fact that that there are stricter rules imposed by governments, but also in the context that you described the theory of the state during the COVID-19. Would you be able to share on that?
Yes. Probably one of the examples is that a school is not closed. School is the main institution of our societies. And as we work with the youth is here in Colombia prepared to give up these discussions in the school in different areas like social democracy. And here in Colombia is very important. We don't think that the isolation is an obstacle to promote our values or our human rights. And we think the important institution, the main institution of the society is the school, and is there where the youth can be resilient, can talk also with the governance and talk to them about the necessities.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to our final presentation for today. So last but not least, Mr. Francisco Rodriguez from the Civil Association for Equality and Justice in Buenos Aires. Francisco, if you are here, can you turn your video on, please? And I don't think you have slides, so hello, welcome.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, hello all. I would like to start by thanking the Global Network of Learning Cities of the UNESCO for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. As I was just introduced, my name is Francisco Rodriguez, and I work at the Civil Association for Equality and Justice in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. Our organization, we work on 3 strategic goals besides COVID and, of course, in relation with COVID. The first one is related to strengthening the quality of democracy and the promotion of civil and political equality. The second strategic goal is related to promoting economic equality and improving the situation of people living in poverty in the city of Buenos Aires. And the third strategic goal is connected with working towards guaranteeing the social rights of vulnerable groups. Most, or I would say if not all of our initiatives and actions are directed at the federal government or at the city of Buenos Aires government. Delving into the key issues identified by the organizers, I would like to begin by giving the context of COVID measures in our country and specifically in Buenos Aires. Since March 20th, the federal government has declared a mandatory quarantine for all the jurisdictions of the country. And even though now most of the provinces are moving into a more advanced and more flexible phase of the quarantine, at the city of Buenos Aires, we are going to reach at least 100 days of very strict isolation policy measures. This means that Argentina in general, and I would say the city of Buenos Aires in particular, has had a great success in controlling the expansion of the virus, with only 700 deaths and around 550 cases every 1 million people. But this also means that the authorities have gained exceptional and concentrated amounts of power, and many instances of participation, demand, or control of the executive power that we are used to as a human rights organizations to use are now closed. For instance, one of our main tools is the use of strategic litigation. But the Supreme Court, both the Supreme Court of Argentina and the Supreme Court of the City of Buenos Aires, have declared that the closure of the courts and allowed only some urgent matters to be litigated. I will return to this in the initiatives. So as a consequence, all of our work is now focused on the effects of COVID in human rights. We had to adjust our agenda during the year. And the initiatives range from national judicial presentations to call for actions in international networks. And I will present, I will try to present 4 of them very quickly as a way of explaining what we do. One of the main issues that we are currently facing is that the COVID is having a differentiated negative impact in vulnerable neighborhoods and settlements in the city of Buenos Aires. Because of how difficult it is to comply with the quarantine measures in those contexts. After 3 months of quarantine, the government has not yet created a specific protocol that can be suitable for the context in such settlements. And on the contrary, still applying a protocol, the protocol that is applied in the general city of Buenos Aires, that does not account for the differences between the wealthier parts of the city and these neighborhoods. As a consequence, we presented a report with a series of organizations of recommendations for the creation of a special protocol, including measures of identification of a special sanitary unit in each settlement, the confirmation of a crisis committee that would be in charge of guaranteeing the rights on practice, you know, the right to water, the right to food, the right to health, to prevent contagion, etc. As I said, the government has yet to adopt this protocol and has recently been sued in order to do so. The second issue that we have identified is related to the rights of the child and the education system that was just brought up by Laura Martinez, I believe. The education system in the city of Buenos Aires, as in many other parts of the world, provides not only for the right to education, but also for the right to food for many children. Regarding the right to education, the ministry decided to implement online classes, but according to the last estimates, at least 14% of the students in public schools do not have access to either a computer or internet, which means that around 100,000 students in public schools of the city of Buenos Aires cannot continue with online classes. So as a consequence, we presented an action called Amparo, which basically is a quick injunctive relief for a judicial process to demand to the city of Buenos Aires to provide free access to internet or technological devices in each cases. And we are happy to say that it was accepted by the court last week. So we are now moving forward to try to implement that decision. And a third issue that we've identified is related with the issue of people with disabilities living in asylums or mental hospitals, and the many obstacles they face as a consequence of that to their ability to effectively exercise all their civil and political rights. The strategy behind the intervention was to promote a social media campaign that in a way tried to show that the temporary adverse effects of the quarantine that we are all seeing is actually the reality for around 12,000 people that live in asylums in Argentina, and that have to face regular issues in order for them to move towards their own standards of living. And they, just as an example, they stay on average for a period of time of 8 years. So we try to in a way sensibilize society into tackling or trying to tackle this issue. And the fourth initiative that I will try to present is that now the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights had presented a report about the pandemic and the human rights. So as a consequence of that, we are now working along with the Inter-American Commission and a series of organizations in Argentina on monitoring and controlling the recommendations the Commission has issued on pandemic and human rights. We are participating in this project that consists of 4 different thematic spaces, which are migrants, children, people deprived of their liberty, and a group that works on social rights more in general, water, habitat, food, to inform the Inter-American Commission on the progress and the breaches of the different obligations that it has presented in this report. And as a conclusion from our work, we understand that the COVID pandemic is showing very clearly the inequalities in our society and worsening the conditions of the vulnerable groups. So we try to, with different degrees of success, to bring some issues forward and try to work presenting either new agendas or still working on the agendas that we were working before, and trying to, in that way, trying to guarantee human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for your presentation. I have a question for you, but we are a little bit short on time. But maybe, you mentioned so much the role that you've had in your campaigns and what you're advocating for. It's really interesting to hear that you've managed to ensure that civil society has taken quite an active role in shaping policymaking at the city level. Would you say that is really the case? And if so, have you been able to do so in partnership with other groups? And how do you make sure that you're not left out of the conversation? Briefly, please.
Yes, of course. As I said, the success of many of our initiatives varies, and actually we try to enforce some of our actions via the judiciary in the city of Buenos Aires. In order to not be left out of the conversation, we have to participate in networks, and basically all the work that we do is in networks with networks of right to the child or right to education or right to health or right to food, etc. So in a way, we try to push different actors, not only the government, but the media, the judiciary, and etc. So that is the way I would say that we are trying to move forward our initiatives.
Thank you. So we actually have our speaker from Melitopol, Mr. Seri Prima, with us today. Seri, can you hear us? And if possible, could you put your video on if you're able to hear me? I see that you're here as part of the panelists. Just want to make sure that you're able to.
Record. Good day, we hear you. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, good day.
Hello, we cannot see you. Would you be able to put your video on?
Just a minute.
Thank you. Hello. Hi. Hello, Melitopol team.
Yeah, hello.
Welcome.
And unfortunately, Serbia is absent today, and we will represent Melitopol.
Thank you so much. So if you can just get started and share with us a few points on what your city has been conducting in terms of guaranteeing and ensuring human rights and civil rights are upheld in the context of the COVID-19, maybe a few initiatives, that would be great.
Yeah, and can we tell you something about situation in our city? Yeah.
Please, of course, go ahead.
Okay. And now I want to represent our speakers. One of them is Natalia Ivanova, and the other one is Katerina Slavova. And I will just translate their speech.
Добрый день всем. Сегодня мы вместе с коллегами поговорим о опыті нашого города в боротьбі з коронавірусом. Як і багато інших країн, Україна важко знаходить баланс між необхідністю введення жорстких заходів для захисту громадян під час пандемії і гарантованим дотриманням прав людини.
It's very difficult for Ukraine, as for other countries, to find a balance between the necessity for introduction of strict limits to protect citizens during the pandemic and guaranteed respect for human rights.
Організації громадського суспільства зосереджують свою діяльність на таких напрямах, як збір благодійної внесків для боротьби з коронавірусом, здійснюють доставку продуктів харчування та ліків вразливим категоріям населення, надають безкоштовні юридичні та інші консультації, проводять онлайн-тренінги і таке інше.
Civil society organizations are focusing on donation to fight the coronavirus, deliver food and medicine to vulnerable groups of population, provide free legal and other consulting, conduct online course, etc.
В свою чергу влада зосереджує свою увагу на введенні різноманітних обмежень, які б могли протистояти поширенню коронавірусу, що сприймається населенням як посягання на їх права та свободи.
The authorities are focusing on imposing various restrictions that could oppose the spread of coronavirus. These restrictions are perceived by the population as an encroachment on their freedom and rights.
До заходів міської влади, спрямованих на протидію коронавірусу у місті Мелітополі, відносять такі: надання прозорої та достовірної інформації про поширення коронавірусної інфекції, налагодження роботи міської гарячої лінії, забезпечено продуктовими наборами та захисними масками близько 1700 осіб на захищених верств населення.
The city authorities organize some steps to counteract the coronavirus in our city, Melitopol. such as providing transparent and reliable information on the spread of coronavirus infection. We text the work of the city hotline with around-the-clock medical duty, and also have provided the food sets and protective masks for about 1,700 people of vulnerable groups.
Мелітопольською міською радою також прийнято ряд рішень на протидію коронавірусної інфекції. По-перше, це заборона проведення всіх масових заходів, торговельної діяльності на території ринків, діяльності суб'єктів господарювання, яка передбачає приймання відвідувачів, закриття всіх навчальних закладів та закладів позашкільної освіти.
And Melitopol City Council adopted some decision on counteraction to coronavirus infection, such as a ban all mass events, trade activities in the city markets, the economic activities which provides the reception of visitors. All educational institution of out-of-school education institution was closed. Prohibition of passengers transportation of urban and long-distance communication, entry and exit from the city, except the person with a special permit, for example, trucks for food. Organization of distance work via the internet or part-time work with using individual protection of workers.
Також це проведення дезінфекції в під'їздах житлових будинків та в містах загального користування, дотримання санітарно-гігієнічних норм та забезпечення роботи тільки суб'єктів господарювання у сфері роздрібної торгівлі, продуктами харчування, медичними засобами зв'язку і провадження банківської та страхової діяльності.
Disinfection in the entrance of residential buildings and public places, observance of sanitary and hygienic norms and rules of preservation of coronavirus infection, ensuring the works for only business in the fields of retail, food trade, fuel, hygiene products, medical devices, communities, banks, and insurance activities.
Боротьба у сфері охорони здоров'я відбувалася у відповідності до діючих постанов Міністерства охорони здоров'я України та Головного державного лікаря України. Це організація роботи пункту забору матеріалів від осіб з категорії груп ризику, організація щоденної доставки матеріалу, госпіталізація хворих з ураженням дихальної системи, які потребують невідкладної допомоги, а також це залучення підприємств, фізичних осіб, громадських організацій, депутатів для забезпечення госпіталю засобами індивідуального захисту, дезінфікуючими засобами та таке інше.
The struggle in the field of health care took place in accordance with the current regulation of the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, such as organizations, the work of clinics which takes analysis from persons who are from the category of risk group, hospitalization the patient with the respiratory system problems who need organ care, and a lot of others.
Міська влада також зіткнулася з акцією протестів підприємців міста через закриття продуктових ринків в умовах карантину, що призвело до втрати багатьма людьми основного джерела заробітку. Щоб пом'якшити негативні наслідки та підтримати якось бізнес, містом було зменшено податкове навантаження. Було зупинено нарахування орендної плати на комунальне майно для суб'єктів господарської діяльності та також встановлено єдиний податок, нульові ставки для першої та другої категорії платників єдиного податку.
Just 1 minute left, just so you know. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead. You can continue. I just wanted to give you the 1 minute mark. You have 1 minute to go for the time of the presentation.
Okay, but we are going to continue, okay?
Please continue
Yes.
for a minute. Thank you.
And the city authorities faced a protest by the city entrepreneurs due to food markets quarantine, which led to the loss of many people's main source of income. And therefore the city authorities decided to support the city's business and reduce the tax burden.
На відміну від заходів боротьби з коронавірусом міської ради, обмежень прав та свобод людей, громадські організації сприяли захисту інтересів населення. Наталія Іванова далі представить нам опит громадських організацій.
And in the contrast to the city authorities, which restrict human rights and freedoms, NGOs help to protect the interest of population in our city. And I want to present Natalia Ivanova. She is Executive Secretary of the Ukrainian Network of Learning Cities, and she will talk about how NGOs contributed to the protection of citizens during the pandemic and guaranteed respect for the human rights.
Не заперечуючи роль держави в наведенні порядку в країні, у громадянського суспільства є навіть важливіше завдання змусити державу бути справедливою та ефективною. І те ж саме відчутно впливає як на діяльність громадських організацій в нашому місті, так і на рівні всієї держави, і особливо це відчутно в умовах карантину.
The state plays the main role in preserving order in the country, civil society, and even more important task, to force the state to be fair and effective. The same effects of the activities of public organization in our city, especially in the epidemic.
Щоб обмеження прав людини не стало постійним, а також з метою захисту найбільш вразливих категорій населення, пріоритетами діяльності громадських організацій в нашому місті, як, мабуть, взагалі всієї держави, було в умовах пандемії пошук спільних рішень та співпраця з місцевими органами влади в питаннях забезпечення прав та свобод людини і громадянина.
In order to human rights limitation do not become permanent, as well as to protect socially sensitive groups of the population, cooperation with the government in providing human and civil rights and freedoms has become a priority for public organization of our city in the pandemic.
Я в своїй доповіді наведу лише деякі приклади, найбільш яскраві, характерні саме для нашого міста, хоча серед всіх інших заходів були такі, що розповсюджені всією країною, це і організація пошиття захисних масок та костюмів для медиків, збір коштів для придбання всього необхідного для медиків, забезпечення нужденних представників вразливих категорій населення продуктами та предметами першої необхідності, розповсюдження інформації та листівок і проведення роз'яснювальної роботи, надання психологічної підтримки та навчання.
There are some colorful examples of the work of local public organization. Organization of sewing protective masks and suits for medical staff, collecting finances to buy necessary for medical staff, providing representatives of vulnerable groups with products and things of basic necessity, distribution of information, giving psychological support, etc.
Такий яскравий приклад, вже Катерина казала, що наші місцеві ринки були зачинені внаслідок того, що було відповідне рішення Кабінету міністрів, але наша громадськість продемонструвала, як можна навіть в умовах карантину впливати на рішення державної влади у співпраці з органами місцевого самоврядування. Одна з наших громадських організацій, Свідоме суспільство Мелітополя, допомогла підприємцям місцевих ринків в об'єднанні їх на акцію протесту проти такої ситуації, коли їх сім'ї опинилися у ситуації загрози їх бізнесу та навіть опинилися на межі фізичного виживання щодо їх доходів, і написали звернення до органів місцевого самоврядування. І виконавчий комітет Мелітопольської міської ради на підставі наданої громадянами петиції звернувся до Кабінету міністрів щодо вимог відновити роботу ринків, і відповідне рішення було прийнято. І, зокрема, було дуже приємний приклад співпраці місцевих громадських активістів з органами місцевого самоврядування, які призвів до рішення державної влади.
An example of the impact of public and government decision at the state level in cooperation with the city authorities showed the entrepreneurs of our city who implement their activities in the city markets. For many businessmen of our city, the trade was forbidden. A public association organized a protest meeting of representatives of business with an appeal to local authorities to support the reaction of the city markets. The Executive Committee of Melitopol City Council sent the petition to the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, and the government adopted this petition and made correction to the previously adopted resolution in terms of reduction quarantine measure. In particular, it has allowed to carry out trade activities in the markets.
Thank you. Sorry, I will have to cut you off here now. Thank you so much for detailing the initiatives happening in Melitopol and what the government is implementing in terms of responses. So we'll get right into the question and answer period for everybody who's here. We will use the next 5-10 minutes to go through some of the questions. We have received quite a lot of questions, but maybe one question that we can address to Melitopol first, so you can have a chance to maybe address that particular topic, and then we can also ask other participants around the table. You know, a question came up on how do you ensure that accurate information is distributed to citizens, and how do you preserve the right of citizens to be accurately informed? How do you also ensure the involvement of multi-ethnic groups in your response, and also ensure that these groups have a right to shape the measures that affect them? Yes, please. Maybe while you talk with your team, we'll ask the city of Loannina to discuss first. Dionysia, if you want to start answering, and then we'll move on to Melitopol so they have time to talk about the question. Thank you.
We organize to inform all the citizens and about the different ethnic groups with a different language. As I mentioned, we have all the message in their native language. Also, we have the mechanisms, the feedback mechanisms. So through telephone questionnaire, we ensure to have the feedback if we have covered all of their needs. Also, if they want something more, if that we didn't know, or we didn't have think about that. And also, we have a good cooperation with the representatives from all of the vulnerable groups, such as elderly people, Roma, and refugees. So with their help, we ensure that the information will reach the people in need.
Thank you. I'll move back to Melitopol if you're ready to answer that question. You're muted at the moment. There we go. I can hear you.
We need some minutes more if you.
No problem.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. Of course. Thank you. So we can maybe move on. If maybe Francisco, if you'd like to address that particular topic, if you're with us, I'm not able to see you. And if not Francisco, we can move back to Laura as well. Francisco, you're back, okay?
Yeah. We are facing actually quite a big challenge regarding access to information, mostly because many of the institutions of the states that are in charge of producing such information are not working and are not considered essential workers. Regarding economic and social rights, that information is necessary in order or I would say, especially for economic and social rights, that information is necessary in order to guarantee those rights. So we presented a note to the city of Buenos Aires government in order for to ensure that the production of information is working. But we've had some talks with even like investigators and some academic units from different universities. And the fact is that without the government actually giving the possibility for some of the essential workers to go and collect information, the issue of access to information is a really big issue. We have presented 5 requests, and only 2 of them have been answered. So we are working towards trying to push the government to allow those workers to go and produce information.
Thank you, Laura, and then Eduardo.
Yes. Well, about the question of the impact of indigenous communities, today our organization are constantly accompanying the strengthening of indigenous communities in our country. We are like the middle part of the indigenous communities and the government. But it's very important to understand that this strengthening must not be external. It must be a construction and a reconstruction from within the community. This applies to all the sectors, just as young people or women must see the organization as an opportunity to demand and protect their rights. We can support and accompany them, but the initiative must be from them. And that initiative also has been reflected in the construction of public policies with a bottom-up approach.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Eduardo, are you still with us? And if you'd like to address that particular question, please go ahead.
Let me put my video.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, this is a great question. I think UN Habitat, we have created a protocol to work in difficult areas in cities. And this concerns mostly slum areas, but also some new areas of migrant populations. And we have created a protocol of response there, and we are targeting and we are working because we have presence in 64 countries with 72 million people in which we can cover different actions. And we have, our protocol covered 3 main areas. One is the direct health response, and we have been partnering with WHO in basically in improving local responses at the level of organization, provision of some conditions of equipment, but also basic services responses associated to that. The second one we call a humanitarian response, in which what we do is community-driven solutions. We work with the communities, we empower them, we work a lot with women associations, and what we do is two important things, all which is the social framework of responses associated to this. But the second one, we have created an urban data mapping knowledge information, and also specific responses associated to data. In some countries, this works unfortunately better when you have more presence of incidence of the disease, because you can map very fast which areas and how to respond. But in others where it's lower, then we are just for the time being working with the community. But we have another level of response, which is the transition from these short-term to medium-term responses, and we are working with cities in the socioeconomic response, particularly through the UNCTs, which is the country responses of the UN system, with local governments, training them on how to better use resources, improve local revenue, and to create community responses in terms of privileging or giving priorities to what kind of actions. This is at the global level, but as I said, we are working in too many slum and also in migration, new areas with UNHCR and other agencies working together there. Mostly that's what we do.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Eduardo. I'll move back to Melitopol for a response to that question, and then we'll move on to our last question.
Щодо захисту прав людей, в нас було в місті організовано ну, такі окремі напрямки, да, це надання волонтерської допомоги найбільш вразливим, соціально вразливим захищеним категоріям населення у вигляді надання продуктових наборів, інформаційна підтримка, надання інформації про ті служби, які можуть надати допомогу в разі домашнього насильства. Інший напрямок це було робота про безпеку медичних працівників та збір коштів, поліпшення їх захисту. І такий ще напрямок, як навчання людей тим основним навичкам, яких їм не вистачає саме в умовах соціальної ізоляції. Але це було не в незалежності від їх національності, їх етнічного походження, бо в нас таких маргіналізованих груп за етнічною ознакою немає в місті. А про права підприємців також Катя казала, що в нас громадянські права, права людей на здійснення підприємницької діяльності також намагалася місцева влада з допомогою звернень до державної влади вирішувати на місцевому рівні про зменшення податків, відкриття роботи ринок і так далі.
And our city authorities have some steps in order to protect our citizens from the pandemic. As for example, we provide transparent information on the spread of coronavirus infection. We also text the work of the city hotline. It was the round-the-clock medical duty, and we have provided some examples for food sets, and we give it for our vulnerable groups of our population, and to protect, we give masks for these people, and also our social service. They ask different social departments of our city to organize some project. For example, it was a quarantine. We see domestic violence, and also your center organized some project such as Girls Rule. It was some webinar and training programs, online meeting, and also we have no problem with multi-ethnic groups of our population, and therefore we help for the people who need this help. We don't ask what was their nationality, we just help the people who really need this help.
Thank you for that. And I'll ask one more question that has to do with some of what Laura discussed, but also we've heard today a bit about citizenship and active engagement in decision-making processes. One question asks that in terms of the youth, how can you ensure participation in decision-making during the pandemic, especially when we're talking about shaping the future of the youth in this current era? Maybe we'll start with Eduardo, if you'd like to answer that question first, and then we'll move on.
I would like to tell you that working in slum areas, you are automatically almost always working with youth population. In Islam, for instance, in Africa, more than 75% of the population in slums are youth. In Latin America and Asia, it goes to 50 to 60%. So for us, working in slums is almost automatic to work, as I was saying, more in the community-driven work with local populations and youth populations. We strengthen them, we provide them with some conditions, sometimes with some equipment, but very often it's much more the organizational, but also very important, the political representation. Vis-a-vis local authorities is to empower them to be recognized as political actors at the Islam level. Because often, as I mentioned in my first introductory remarks, Islam areas are particularly hit by the pandemic. And so our responses there concern mostly the providing services, organizing the community, and youth associations are extremely important to work with us. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I think we'll move on to Laura, if you can give us a few remarks, and then I'll ask Dionysia, and we'll finish with Francisco and the Melitopol team.
Yes, well, for different institutional or non-institutional participation instance, for example, in Colombia, there are youth councils that contribute to the construction of public policy on the local stage. In Uruguay, there's a social media campaign that has been promoted in which the voice of youth around current issues is the focus. And also today in Portugal, in an alliance between Ubuntu School, our organization, and the national government, we're providing tools and participation scenarios to the youth. However, this is still a challenge to give visibility to young people in remote areas, and it's a challenge that we must continue pressure governments to strengthen education in these areas.
Thank you for that. Maybe so, Dionysia, if you have a few comments you'd like to make on this. In Francisco, if you're here and you're ready, available before Dionysia gets back, would you be able to comment? Thank you.
Yes. As Laura said, we also see a great challenge in making youth participate. At least in Argentina, the public policies don't appear to be very to have a rights of the child and an adolescent's perspective, not at all. So in order to do that, and after 2 months of the Congress not working, we were able to work with some organizations in the federal level to give participation to the youth in the Commission of Family and Youth. We are trying to work with them in order to develop some initiatives for them to try to participate in public policy making, not only during the lockdown and the COVID crisis related situation, but also more in general, as we see that the youth participation is really something that we need to work on.
Thank you. Maybe Melito Paul, if you're ready to answer that question.
Yes, we're ready. And we have, for example, for the decision-making process, we have a coordination department, and this department always connected with the business, with medical staff, and with the social group of our population, and they if they have any question, we discuss it and make a different decision which was connected with coronavirus infection.
Thank you. Dionysia, if you have any last words you'd like to comment on that question. Okay, so I think if not, we can move on to our closing remarks for today by the director of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, Mr. David Achouarena. I'd like to give you the floor for some final remarks before we close off this webinar.
Thank you, and thanks to all the panelists for very interesting and complementary perspectives. Maybe four comments, on our topic for today, based on your contributions. First of all, I think that what we saw very clearly from your input is that the crisis has, played like an amplifier of inequalities and placing in particular the rights of the poor at risk. I think that all of you have, kind of illustrated this phenomena. The second one relates to the freedom of information, which is also threatened in the current context. And information is key, as we know, for actually, fighting against the pandemic and responding to the pandemic. So it's a very sensitive, ingredient in the present situation, and it's also an ingredient that has been actually threatened not only by limitations to the freedom of information in certain contexts, but also to the spread of fake news, as we saw, in this current context. And here, I think it relates also to the importance in terms of education, maybe of skills to which we've had, already paying increasing attention, which is digital skills, and digital literacy and media literacy. So I think that in a way, this crisis also amplified and stressed the importance of promoting and giving, access to those skills. I think that also your contribution shows that the right to education is at risk in spite of the measures that have been taken. School closure has resulted, in spite of the implementation of decent education arrangements, has resulted in dropout or disengagement, sometimes of a large share of the school of the student population, as we heard, for instance, in the case of the city of Buenos Aires, but it's also the case in many other places. So that's something that constitutes a major, really, a major risk to the right to education. And finally, the fourth, I think, comment that I'd like to make, it's the importance of civil society organizations. And I think that we heard through the contributions and the action of the Civil Association for Equality and Justice in Latin America, that really civil society organizations have a key role to play, in particular to monitor the implementation of basic fundamental rights, but also to enter in a strategic dialogue with public authorities, including with authorities at municipal level. So I think that we've had a very interesting illustration of this. So again, I'd like to thank all our panelists, which gave us a very, I think, comprehensive perspective of this topic, which is really central to the crisis that we are going through at the moment. I'd like now just to say a few remarks, since this is our last seminar. I think that it's important maybe to try to sum up some of the lessons we've learned so far from the experience of the cities member of the UNESCO network of learning cities, about how at the local level municipal governments are actually responding to this crisis. First of all, I'd like to recall that the initiative that UL took with launching this series of webinars is part of a broader initiative at UNESCO level to actually provide support to our member states in responding to this crisis. And this has taken various forms, including the establishment of a global coalition to really develop partnerships and seek expertise from different stakeholders in different areas to really provide and mobilize support that can be useful for our member states. With this series of webinars within the framework of the Global Network of Learning Cities, we've tried to recognize also one of the features that was recalled this just now by Mr. Moreno in his statements, that the COVID-19 crisis is first an urban crisis. So the cities are really at the front line of this crisis and need to find ways to respond, of course, within the framework of a national, policy. So in initiating this series of webinars, what we tried to do is really to provide a forum, a platform of exchange, for cities. First of all, to review the situation at local level in different parts of the world, in cities that have been already deeply affected by the pandemic. I'd like to recall that one of our first, speakers was, in fact, the city of Wuhan. But also cities where as some of those who spoke today, cities that have not yet been fully impacted by the crisis. So this kind of review, element was an important dimension for these webinars. But also, of course, what was even more important was to identify innovation, good practices, that have been designed and implemented at local level, and that could inspire responses in other parts of the world, in other cities. So this really exchange was central to what we tried to do through those webinars. I'd like to recall that after starting with some general, I would say, debate about the impact of the crisis at city level and the responses of cities, we've tried to focus on specific topics like today. So we had 16, in fact, thematic webinars that look at really a wide range of issues, use of distance and open education, the the issue in prisons. We had also a concern for migrants, specific attention to migrants, refugees. So we had a very, targeted and specific discussions, and we also had webinars that, catered for specific, I would say, communities in terms of language. So we had a webinar for Francophone countries, one in Spanish, and one also, in fact, today in Arabic for the Arab region. So for each seminars each week, we had between 150 and over 500, participants. And what we, I think, documented through those exchanges is, in particular, how cities have been able to respond to the crisis in three, in three ways, in three directions. First of all, in contributing to what is called now the continuity of learning, to ensure that teaching and learning keeps going in spite of school closure. And this, in particular, was possible through the use of ICT, and cities have been instrumental in facilitating this process. Secondly, cities have been also key in promoting health education, and through also information campaigns, so that to ensure that people were also changing their behaviors to prevent the spread of the disease. And we've had a number of examples of how this is happening. And we also had a lot of examples, including in our discussions today, both in Melitopol and also in the city of Ioannina in Greece, of how cities are actually developing strategies and programs to protect the most vulnerable. Including in the field of education, but also in a broader, I would say, social protection package. So those are three, areas in which we see that cities, learning cities, have been playing a key role. I think that we've had, through the different webinars, very interesting illustrations of how learning cities are also resilient cities, inclusive cities, and innovative cities. So those three dimensions, I think, have been documented in a very, comprehensive manner. So what are the lessons learned after those, 17 webinars? I'd like maybe to stress 6 areas that we can actually, where we can learn lessons from what we've heard from cities. First of all, I think that the current crisis and the situation at local level has shown that the COVID-19 situation has amplified, but also revealed structural inequalities. So this is something that we've seen in all cities, in all parts of the world. And again, this is something that was mentioned today. So to some extent, the crisis has created, or maybe broaden inequalities, but to a large extent, I think it has really revealed things that were already present. And maybe the second element is that this crisis has contributed to develop new innovations, new ways of actually responding and addressing those inequalities, including through the development of digital tools and through also responding to the challenge of connectivity, as we heard today in the case of Buenos Aires, where now the poor communities have free access to internet. The third element that came out very strongly, I think, from the debate we've had is the importance of families and of family learning. So this is something, again, that maybe we rediscovered, that learning does not take place only at school, that schools and teachers are not the only ones which play a very important role for developing knowledge and skills, but families are also very important. So this family learning dimension is something that came out also very strongly, and in a number of places we've seen that municipal authorities have also taken initiatives to support this process of not only family learning but intergenerational learning. I think the fourth element that came out very closely and very strongly is the key role of teachers. We've seen that the implementation of ICT and technology-based responses couldn't really work without adequate support from teachers. So this is another element, that I think we need to retain. And again, in a number of cities, also the municipal authorities have contributed to provide support to teachers and to facilitate the interaction between teachers and students staying at home. The fifth dimension relates to the importance of providing targeted support to poor families and poor children. And I think, again, this is something where cities in all parts of the world, for which cities have been playing a very important role. And here I'd like to single out one particular dimension, which is school meals. Meals provided to students and sometimes to their families as well, as a very critical ingredient. And finally, the importance of partnership at local level, and of course at the core of this partnership, the role of municipal authorities, and in particular to be able to make bridges between different dimensions, education, but also social support and culture. So those three elements, I think, are key to the responses that learning cities have been able to play. So I think that we saw that through this crisis, that the concept of learning cities, but also that the learning cities approach as is a very relevant approach and concept that facilitated an integrated approach, and that also was able to mobilize really the key actors at local level. So this was maybe even reinforced in the context of the crisis, but this is probably one of the major elements and benefits of this particular approach to lifelong learning at local level. So again, I'd like to thank all the panelists, not only the panelists of today, but all the panelists and the cities that contributed to our series. I would like also to stress the fact that we will be, providing additional information. We're going to prepare a report consolidating all the contributions, the lessons learned from this series of webinars. So this report will be soon available online. And in addition to the report, we will also publish a number of case studies documenting some of the most innovative approaches that have been presented during the seminars. So again, thanks again for you know, your participation, and I would like also to mention the fact that although this series is over, we're going to continue the discussion with cities within in collaboration with a network called Pascal. So there will be, you know, another series of webinars that you will be able to find information on this on our website for those who will be interested to join. So thanks to all, and I hope to see you maybe next time in your city in a face-to-face environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everybody for the great presentations. Just so everybody knows, the slides you saw today will be uploaded to our website along with the summary of the webinar, and this is done for each webinar. The webinar is also recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. Please feel free to consult that if needed, and feel free to share with your networks. Thank you everybody, and have a nice day.